It was an ordinary evening, or so I thought. George, my husband, came home from work, but there was something different about him. His face looked tense, his steps heavier. Without saying a word, he dropped a stack of papers on the kitchen table with a thud that echoed through our small home. I turned to look, confused, and then, without warning, he delivered the words that would tear my world apart. "I'm divorcing you to marry the boss's daughter. Get out now." I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in disbelief. We had just welcomed our first child into the world, a beautiful baby girl, and I thought our lives were only beginning to flourish. Yet, here was my husband, cold and distant, throwing away everything we had built. "I'm going to be the next CEO. No hard feelings," he added casually, as if it were the simplest of decisions. I clutched our 3-month-old daughter in my arms, staring at him in shock. This couldn't be real. I couldn't have heard him correctly. We had shared so much together: dreams, struggles, plans for the future. How could he betray me like this? Before I could even respond, he moved toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence that had filled the room. "Unlock the door!" I shouted, rushing after him as he slammed it shut behind him, locking me out of my own home. I banged on the door, desperate, but he didn't answer. Outside, the wind howled as if echoing my cries. The night was pitch black, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones. I stood there in disbelief, holding our baby tightly to my chest. What was I going to do now? Where could I go? My name is Jessica, and at 27 years old, my life was crumbling before my eyes. As I stood in the cold, my thoughts raced back to the early days of my marriage. George had been so kind, so supportive. 3 years ago, when I lost my mother, George was there, helping me through the darkest days of my life. I had thought he was my rock, the person who would stand by me no matter what. But looking back now, there had been signs, subtle changes in his behavior that I had ignored. 6 months ago, he had started working longer hours, taking business trips more frequently, and even spending weekends away, claiming it was all for work. "Golf is part of my job," he'd say, brushing off my concerns when I asked why he wasn't spending time with us anymore. I had believed him. I thought it was just the stress of his career. After all, he had always been ambitious, always wanting more for us. But as I stood there in the freezing night, it became clear that those business trips and golf outings had been something else entirely. They were lies. My mind reeled as I realized just how deep his betrayal went. He had been planning this for months, possibly longer. And now, here I was, alone, with no parents to turn to, no close friends to call. All I had was my daughter, and I had to find a way to protect her. I wandered the streets for what felt like hours, the weight of my situation pressing down on me with every step. My daughter stirred in my arms, her tiny face peeking out from under the blanket. The wind was brutal, biting at my skin, and I knew I had to find shelter soon. But where? I had no phone, no money. The small wallet in my apron had just $30 from an earlier grocery run, not nearly enough to pay for a hotel room. Tears welled up in my eyes as I stumbled upon a small, run-down hotel on a quiet street. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The warmth of the lobby was a stark contrast to the cold outside, and an elderly couple stood behind the front desk, their faces kind and gentle. I approached them with trembling hands, explaining my situation as best as I could, without breaking down completely. The woman, sensing my distress, offered me a seat by the fireplace. "How much for one night?" I asked, my voice shaky. $50, the man said, eyeing my weary face. I looked down at the wallet in my hand, knowing I didn't have enough. Just as I was about to leave, the woman stepped forward. "Stay," she said softly. "We'll take what you have, and you can pay the rest later." I couldn't believe it. They were offering me a lifeline when I needed it most. That night, I held my daughter close, trying to figure out what to do next. I had no home, no job, and no family left to help me. But I knew I couldn't give up, not for myself, but for my daughter. She was the only light in this dark, uncertain world, and I had to find a way to move forward. The next morning, I gathered my strength, and made my way back to the house. I had to talk to George to make him understand that he couldn't just throw us out like this. But as I approached the house, I saw something that made my heart stop. George's car sped past me, and in the passenger seat was a woman I recognized. She was young, beautiful, and dressed in designer clothes, George's boss's daughter. Everything fell into place at that moment. All those late nights, all those business trips and golf outings, they had been with her. He had been planning this from the beginning, using me for as long as it suited him. And now that he had a new, wealthier future ahead of him, he had no use for me. When I reached the house, George was already gone. The door was locked, and there was no way for me to get inside. I sat in the cold garage waiting for hours, hoping he would come back so we could talk. But when he finally did, he ignored me entirely. He walked past me as if I didn't exist, and when I tried to speak, he pushed me away. That night, as I sat in the cold, the reality of my situation hit me like a ton of bricks. George wasn't coming back. He had chosen his new life, and there was no room for me or our daughter in it. I was on my own now, and I had to figure out how to survive. The next few months were the hardest of my life. I found a small apartment and a job working at a local diner, scraping by on minimum wage while trying to care for my daughter. Every day was a struggle, but I refused to let George's betrayal break me. I had lost everything, but I still had my pride, my determination, and the love of my daughter. One day, while I was working at the diner, I overheard a conversation that piqued my interest. A regular customer, an older woman, was talking about a job opening at a nearby hotel. "They're looking for someone to help with the kitchen," she said, "and it pays pretty well." Something inside me clicked. I had always loved cooking, and I had become quite good at it over the years. Maybe this was the opportunity I needed to turn my life around. With a renewed sense of purpose, I applied for the job the next day. The hotel was small and family-owned, run by an elderly couple who reminded me of the kind people who had sheltered me that cold night. They welcomed me with open arms, and soon, I found myself working long hours in the kitchen, cooking meals for the hotel guests. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and it gave me the chance to provide for my daughter. As the months turned into years, I threw myself into my work, determined to create a better life for myself and my daughter. My cooking became popular among the guests, and soon the hotel started attracting more and more customers. The elderly couple who owned the hotel noticed my dedication and offered me a chance to take over the business when they retired. At first, I was hesitant. I had no experience running a hotel, and the thought of taking on such a responsibility scared me. But I knew that this was my chance to prove to myself and to the world that I was capable of more than anyone had ever given me credit for. I took the leap, and with the couple's guidance, I learned the ins and outs of the business. My cooking became the hotel's signature, and as word spread, the hotel flourished. We became known as a cozy, family-friendly place with delicious food, and soon we were expanding. One hotel became 2, then 3, and before I knew it, I was the proud owner of 10 successful hotels and restaurants across the country. 10 years had passed since George had thrown me out of our home. My daughter was now a bright, happy 10-year-old who loved helping me in the kitchen. We had built a life for ourselves, one filled with love, laughter, and success. I had moved on from the pain of my past, focusing on the future and the opportunities ahead. But one day, while walking to my restaurant, I heard a voice from behind me that sent a chill down my spine. "Jessica," the voice called out, "I finally found you." I turned around to see a man I barely recognized. It was George, but he looked nothing like the man I had once loved. His clothes were dirty and torn, his face sunken and desperate. He looked as though life had chewed him up and spit him out. "Please," he begged, "lend me some money. I've fallen on hard times. I borrowed from some dangerous people, and if I don't pay them back soon, they'll hurt me." For a moment I stood there staring at the man who had once broken my heart so completely. He had left me and our daughter with nothing, but now he was the one begging for help. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, but I couldn't forget the pain he had caused. You left me when I needed you most, I said, my voice steady. You abandoned your own daughter. Now, you expect me to help you? He tried to grab my arm, but I pulled away. Jessica, please, I made a mistake. I should never have left you. I was wrong. But I knew better. George wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was just desperate. He had lost everything, and now he thought he could come back to me and pick up where we left off. But I wasn't the same person anymore. I had built a life for myself, a life that didn't include him. Goodbye, George, I said, turning my back on him for the last time. I don't need your forgiveness, and I don't need you. As I walked away from George that day, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. For years, I had carried the weight of his betrayal on my shoulders, but now I was free. I had moved on, built a successful career, and created a loving home for my daughter. I didn't need him, and I never would. I walked into my restaurant, greeted by the familiar warmth of the kitchen and the laughter of my employees. My daughter was waiting for me, eager to show me the new recipe she had been working on. As I looked at her, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. She had grown into a strong, independent young girl, and I knew that no matter what life threw at us, we would always be okay. Looking back, I realized that George had done me a favor by leaving. He had shown me what I was truly capable of, and in the end, I had come out stronger because of it. I had turned my pain into success, and I would never let anyone take that away from me. Life wasn't easy, but it was mine,